Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Kennedy Center for our book club. My name is Jason Moran. I'm the artistic director for jazz at the Kennedy Center, and today is deep in August 2021. Some things have changed, some things have not. But I'll tell you one thing that is true: books are for real, and the history is real. So it's a real pleasure to invite my two panelists to join me in this book discussion. But before I say that, I want to say and thank everyone who has continued to support the arts and support the Kennedy Center in particular, keeping us going, keeping the blood flowing through the institution. It's a very difficult and trying time for performers, for audiences, for all of us. But somehow the work will continue to take us to a kind of liberty. That's kind of what we're here to talk about tonight. It's the kind of liberty that exists in books. I have found that a lot of jazz history lies in these books, and sometimes it's not discussed in the jazz world. So this is a place for me to rid myself of the ignorance I have around the music, so that I can have a newfound and more, let's say, informed way to play the piano. Anyway, our jazz subscriptions are for sale. We have a modified season upcoming. Hope you can join us. There's lots of good things on the season. But here we are tonight in August 2021 to talk about James Weldon Johnson's book. Um, and this is a fun night. Our first book club event featured the book Jazz by Toni Morrison, that featured a conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Alexander and NEA Jazz Master vocalist Dianne Reeves. And tonight we are reading the autobiography of an ex-colored man. You can have this cover, or let's see, wait, where's my other cover? You can have this cover. There's lots of covers you can have out here for the books that you need to read. And speaking of covers, before I invite everybody else, this is my version of Lift Every Voice and Sing, an illustrated version that the great artist Elizabeth Catlett did. You know, so let's look for book covers instead of musical ones. With that, let me invite two dear friends, two brilliant, brilliant people who I just also wanted to have a chance to discuss this book with. Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, great author of a book called May We Forever Stand, which we'll discuss in a moment. Looking for Lorraine. Please welcome Dr. Imani Perry.
Hello.
Good to see you.
So good to see you.
That's a nice everything happening there. We got the flow. We got the flow today. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, it's a
And
pleasure.
also we have, so Imani is in Philadelphia, and joining us from the West Coast out in the Bay Area is saxophonist and composer, the illustrious Mark Turner.
Hey, how's it going?
Great. Good to see you.
Fantastic. Good to see you
Yes.
all.
Oh, and thank you for joining me. This is, I mean, talking about books is a thing that, a lot of musicians do, but sometimes we talk about records maybe more than we talk about books. And I might argue that maybe we should talk about books a little bit more. Maybe we should talk about books a little bit more.
Yes.
But I wanted to first start with Lift Every Voice and Sing, the song that was playing in the beginning was the group The Bandwagon, and I. And we were playing Lift Every Voice and Sing, and we're thinking about Imani's beautiful book about the song, about where the song sits in the Black community. And Imani, I want to just jump like
Okay.
far into the song, right? Like, at the beginning of the book, you talk about hearing your son learn the song. Tell us that story again.
Yeah. Also that was just an absolutely gorgeous rendition, and I hope we can talk a little bit about it because it's just.
Hmm.
So my baby, when he was about to go to college, but when he was 5 years old, comes home singing "Lift Every Voice and Sing," and frankly, I was astonished because he was a student in a predominantly white school. He hadn't been in the places where we usually learn it, right, culturally, and
Hmm.
that very frequently. So he comes home singing it, and I said, "Where'd you learn that?" And he said, "They're teaching it at school." So then we went home to Alabama for Thanksgiving. And when we're home, I say to my son, as we do culturally, why don't you, stand up and let everybody know what you've learned at school, what song you've learned, right? And I have a very large family, so there's, dozens of people in the den. And he stands up and he begins to sing, And the entire family stands up with them and sings alongside and raises their fists.
Oh, right.
And that's because my aunts and uncles are the Black Power generation, right? And the song changed over generations over the 20th century, but it was this really profound moment for me for thinking about the transmission of tradition through that song as this kind of precious, artifact and practice. And that when I wanted to tell the history of the song, I knew it was important to tell how it was embedded in our lives. It wasn't just the song, but the song signified something about how Black people lived, a kind of resilience, a kind of struggle, a kind of collectivity that came through the message of the song itself. James Weldon Johnson wrote it.
Yeah, James Weldon Johnson and his brother
Rosamond.
Johnson. Yeah. You know, Mark, do you remember when you were first learning the song or first hearing the song?
I don't know. I can't say the exact moment, but I think I heard it first in my grandmother's church. So my grandmother on my father's side of the family. So that's northern Louisiana, Ruston, Louisiana, if anyone knows where that is. But so I think that's the first time I had heard it. And I would go there every other summer. So I spent a lot of time there. So, yeah, I would hear that song quite a bit, basically every other
it's deep because it's embedded also in the hymnal, you know.
Yeah,
like,
it's there.
It's like talk about goals, you know, like you write a song that gets in the hymnal that everywhere.
It's quite an achievement. Yes.
Yeah, it is. You know?
It is an achievement.
It is. And I think about the brothers, right? The brothers writing this song, you know, and John Rosamond Johnson he goes to New England Conservatory where I teach now. And I think about like what it was for him to go there, then to go to Europe and continue to kind of like develop his composition practice. Yes. But that he and his brother would write this song that would continue, like Imani, you said, like, you know, from the Black Power generation, it felt like this, right? But when he wrote it, it felt another way. And, you know, and the thing you bring up in the book, which I really love, is about what you call Black formalism, you know. Yes. So like you tell the story of your family then rising to their feet, because when you play this song among the community knows to stand for the song. It is but talk about this like maybe about Black formalism, one of your themes in the book.
Yeah. I mean, so, you know, Black formalism is this term that I used to talk about the kind of ritual practices of Black cultural spaces rooted in the South that were where you have like a sense of dignity, ritual, formality, grace, right? It's sort of every culture has a spectrum, right? From the vernacular to the formal, every single one. But what happens often, and we have these extraordinary vernacular, like kind of, you know, the juke joint to hip hop, like spaces in Black culture, but we also have these formal traditional spaces. And I talk about how after emancipation, after the promise of Reconstruction is dashed, you know, you have the veil of Jim Crow, to use Du Bois's term, come down over Black life. Black people like jump into action and start building institutions, building, writing histories, formalizing musical, traditions, and also having these like sites of pageantry and civic and social associations, in addition to the church, right? There's this whole spectrum. So we talk a lot about the church. We have all these institutions, and those become places where formalist practices are embedded, and they're ways of showing self-regard and dignity in a society that is diminishing, that is rejecting, that doesn't acknowledge the fullness of who they are. So they're really important places for and rituals, and the song is like a key aspect of those traditions, right?
It is. You know, I was reminded of often, let me say this, I'm reminded of my ignorance, of an ignorant time of being a student at Manhattan School of Music. And we had a beautiful Black student union, a Pan-African student union. And our kind of, you know, our instructor who made sure that we were on target was a great classical singer, Betty Allen, one, great performer, performing at the Metropolitan Opera. She was working at Harlem School of the Arts, had a weekly class where not only my wife, Alicia Hall Moran, but many opera singers would go there every Saturday to practice their spirituals for her, all of this, right? So she was who you would go see. So Betty Allen, one day she found out that we didn't want to play Lift Every Voice and Sing for the concert. And she came in and said, I don't know what you all are thinking, but you're playing that song in so many words.
Right.
And it was a reminder, about what songs really mean, And I think maybe sometimes in conservatories, the songs like this are often stripped of like their historical integrity. In a conservatory, I'm talking about, where we say, okay, well, this is the song, and it goes like this it's in A flat, and it goes like, and it's kind of got this tradition, but we don't say what it means to people, and that became a frustration that I would have to solve after I got out of school, which was how do I relearn what I know about the music that I love improvising on, and what that actually means to turn a phrase or to rephrase it the way Billie Holiday or the way Louis Armstrong does. Those liberties were not written down. Those liberties were actually imagined in the moment and felt and then expressed and then turned around with something brilliant right after that too, on and on and on. But changing the idea about what that song means was pivotal, because the last thing you want to do is also anger the giant. And Betty Allen is a person who we want to honor her. So when she kind of pointed that finger, it was a moment for us, and I'm also thankful for the teachers, like both of you all, each of us, teachers who continue to stay with the young minds to remind them about what it means to move through this, and also then to find their own pepper that they can use on the song. So, I'm glad we got to discuss that song, which is now continues to become more and more well known, but it does then dive us into this novel, The Autobiography of the Ex-Colored Man. And I'd say I chose the book because I'd read it a long time ago, and I wanted to talk about James Weldon Johnson again, as this thinker who kind of was not only writing the history down, but also kind of really wanting to tussle with the sonic aspect of it too. So he's really dealing with the sound and the text. He's unafraid to do that. Kind of like a Gordon Parks, like who just imagines across mediums, like what he can do. So I chose the book, right? Kind of about a piano player, not really about a piano player, kind of about a piano player who is going through life, I'd say treading the line between whether, because of his skin color, he can be Black or he can be white. And many times through his life, he's reminded of who he is, whether he wants to or not. And by the end, which we'll discuss, is a really beautiful, powerful last paragraph. We'll discuss kind of what he has learned by the end. And so I want to start with a little, and now I'm going to pull out these are my glasses that I developed during the quarantine. Allows me to read. But I wanted to start with one of the early moments in his life, early in the book, when he realizes that he's not white, and he's in school, and he says, one day near the end of my second term at school, the principal came into our room, and after talking to the teacher for some reason said, quote, "I wish all of the white scholars to stand for a moment." I rose with the others. The teacher looked at me and said, calling my name, said, "You sit down for the present and rise with the others." Quote, I did not quite understand her and questioned, "Ma'am?" She repeated with a softer tone in her voice, "You sit down now and rise with the others." I sat down, dazed, right? He goes home. He says, as I passed through the hallway, I saw that my mother was busy with one of her customers. I rushed up into the looking glass hung on the wall. For an instant, I was afraid to look. But when I did, I looked long and earnestly. I had often heard people say to my mother, "What a pretty boy you have." I was accustomed to hear remarks about my beauty, but now, for the first time, I became conscious of it and recognized it. I noticed the ivory whiteness of my skin, the beauty of my mouth, the size of liquid darkness of my eyes, and how the long black lashes that fringed and shaded them produced an effect that was strangely fascinating, even to me. I noticed the softness and glossiness of my dark hair that fell in waves over my temples, making my forehead appear whiter than it really was. How long I stood there gazing at my image, I do not know. And like it's a moment of him looking at himself, more importantly, that he comes home and runs and looks into the looking glass, which I prefer over mirror. He looks into the looking glass at himself, and then begins to examine and put language to his features. How did this strike you when you all kind of came upon this part of the book?
Oh.
Go ahead. You go first, though.
Oh no, I was gonna say, it's there's versions of this in lots of different works of literature, right? So there's Du Bois in Souls of Black Folk, who was Johnson's friend and colleague, when he gives a Valentine card to a white girl and she rejects it, and he's in elementary school. There's County Cullen, who recounts being called a slur. And those moments of sort of reckoning with what it means to be Black in childhood are heart-wrenching. So this particular, right, is about his color, right, and being red, him seeing himself as white, or at least not different, right, and then being marked as such, and knowing the way the other Black children are marked. So it's a gut punch. It's power, but it's also something that's really kind of a key part of Black experience, right? In an age of innocence, you encounter the mark of difference, in this society. Yeah. 100 plus years later, it's still true, right? Yeah.
Very. Yeah. Mark, I'm sorry.
No, I that section was interesting, the entire section, because before he talks about his friend Shiny, right? And talks about what an excellent student he is, his comportment, so on and so forth, and notices how the other children treat him, the white children. But he doesn't associate himself with Shiny, right? Which I thought was interesting. Then the very next paragraph, the gauntlet comes down and he realizes that he's right next to Shiny.
Yes. That's my homeboy for life.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and Shiny comes back later in the book, right?
Right.
He's successful at his vocation. And also the other thing that is kind of interesting is that that's when the white kids realize that he's Black, but the Black kids already know that he's Black.
Right.
Yes. I found that kind of interesting. They always know, and they accept him, even though he kind of wasn't sure if he belonged or not. And anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's a moment that, well, clearly for the rest of the book, he then has to battle with this.
Yeah, exactly.
His mother, he only meets his father in this book twice. Once kind of when he's young, once when he's later and he's traveling.
Right.
And so he doesn't know who his white father really is. But his white father is the one who sends a piano to the house.
Right.
After a meeting, his mother introduced him to his father, and the father left, but then sent a piano. And this is all happening up in Connecticut, up here. And so there's a moment, so then the piano comes, and the piano becomes a place where he begins to sink a lot of his energy. He also starts to realize that he can hear things, he can learn hymns from his mother and play them immediately, right? He's learning that the ear kind of can trace language, that will kind of help him out later in his life. There's something about the musician's ear, which, a lot of musicians talk about this, how the ability to pick up language, because you learn language by listening to sound, not listening to words. You listen to the sound. So it's a thing that he develops over time. But when he wants to go to college in the South, he comes to Atlanta, and a string of events take him kind of not to school.
Right.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
Which when reading this, I thought oh, this is like a parent's worst nightmare, right? You send your kid to school. Yep. He wants to go to school in Atlanta, and ends up getting robbed. When I was sharing the story, part of the story with my wife, Alicia said, "Didn't he know?"
Right.
Didn't he know not to put his money in the trunk and leave it in the room? Right? Like these are the
He'd been in
things.
he'd been in
But he
Connecticut.
didn't
He
know.
didn't
Right, he
know.
didn't.
Right.
He didn't know exactly. Yeah.
You know, like so that, you know, but after being in the South for a while, and there's a beautiful part where he's working in a tobacco factory.
Yes.
And he works his way up and he learns Spanish, and then he gets this job as a reader for for all the workers. It's in the center of the room, and he reads these texts in Spanish all day to everyone who's working. Then he decides that he wants to come back to New York. And I want to talk about his return to New York and what he sees when he comes back to the city, because there are two things before I pass it over to you all. But I want to talk about how he talks about New York, the language that New York gets, because it's much the same in the first book we read in Toni Morrison's Jazz. She talks about the angle of the city, the shadows it makes, what lurks in the shadows, the sounds coming down the, you know, out of the rooms. You know, she kind of like, she puts some beautiful language on how New York City felt in the 1920s. Now he's actually living in the time that he wrote this book, right, in the early 1900s. And he says, New York City is the most fatally fascinating thing in America. She sits like a great witch at the gate of the country, showing her alluring white face and hiding her crooked hands and feet under the folds of her white garments, constantly enticing thousands from far within and tempting those who come across the seas to go no farther. So, like, you know, like this is the city that drew me, you know, you know, like the city he describes. It's because what you know about the city here is that it is not easy. It will always be tough. But there is also something that gets born here despite the concrete, you know, of what the place is. And when he gets here, he starts to look for a job. And then the most fascinating thing is he hears ragtime music. Now, this shook me to the core because him talking about ragtime is kind of like, you know, it's the birth of a new sound. The piano can do a thing it could not do before, you know, and he talks about hearing it in a club. And I read this really, really quickly. Just lost it again. Oh, Lord. Oh, there. No, that's not it. There it is. Right. Right. Okay, right. Oh, yeah, no, this is so good. Okay. All right. Okay, right. After the singer had responded to a rousing encore, the stout man at the piano began to run his fingers up and down the keyboard. This he did in a manner which indicated that he was a master of a good deal of technique. Then he began to play, and such playing, I stopped talking to listen. I stopped talking to listen. Then he began to play. I stopped talking to listen. It was a music of a kind I'd never heard before. It was the music that demanded physical response, patting of the feet, drumming of the fingers, or nodding of the head in the time of the beat. The barbaric harmonies and audacious resolutions, often consisting of an abrupt jump from one key to another. The intricate rhythms in which accents fell in the most unexpected places, but in which the heat was never lost, produced a curious effect. And to the piano player, the dexterity of his left hand in making rapid octave runs and jumps was little short of marvelous. And with his right hand, he frequently swept half the keyboard with clean-cut chromatics, which he fitted in so nicely as never to fail to arouse in his listeners a sort of pleasant surprise at the accomplishment of his feat. We went home, and then at the end he says, we went home and got into bed. I fell into a fitful sort of sleep with ragtime music continually ringing in my ears.
Yeah.
Now, you know, we don't talk about ragtime like that.
No.
Like we talk about ragtime as a thing, you know, like you hear coming out of the ice cream truck, or, you know, like Scott Joplin, the entertainer, right? Like these kind of like, it gets reduced almost to 4 songs of ragtime history, but he's talking about it when it's fresh. And the thing that it made me wanted to ask you was, do you remember a moment when you heard a sound for the first time and what that jolt was, that similar to what he's talking about in hearing this ragtime?
Oh, wow. That's quite a question. The first time. I mean, there's lots of songs I remember hearing the first time and them having an effect. Like I remember hearing Sugar Hill Gang Double Dutch Bus and being like,
Oh
what
yeah,
is this?
remember
Yeah.
that.
Right.
Right, like riding over. I remember where we
I
were,
remember
the
that.
bridge we were crossing, and I was like, "What is this?" And my
Mm.
mother was like, "Oh, I don't like that." Right, that's what my mom said, right?
That's funny.
And it's interesting because music is more frequently for me, I think of nostalgically. I also
Mm.
remember, actually, though, for me, hearing Monk did something, and I was older when I remember hearing him, and the sort of, and actually, I mean, in some ways, it's that, there's an emotional similarity for me between him and Ragtime, and that, like, the permutations aspect, the
Yes.
repetition, like
Right.
going back. So that, like, for me, I was like, oh, this is what I'm trying to do as a writer. And of course, Black writers are always trying to chase behind musicians, and kind of enviously, but that, so, but yeah, that's an interesting.
Yeah. You talking right? Like, because also you remember, that's the great part about great music is you know where you are when it hits you,
Yeah.
and it's not like even that you would remember every sound you heard, but you know like how it triggers, and then that means it gets like sewn into your DNA or into your backbone, and it just lives with you. And then when you hear the song, you're like, Mark, did you have a feeling, or a song or?
Oh, there are plenty. Yeah, I'll just have to pick one. I mean, I would say probably maybe the first was there's a lot of them actually. Well, I was going to say the first one was the first time I heard Coltrane. That's probably true for most. I was I have two collections of jazz records from my stepfather and my biological father, and I think this is my biological father's. I think it was My Favorite Things. First time I heard that.
Wow.
Right.
And I was 16, and I went, whoa, wait a minute, what is this?
Right.
Maybe the other time was, strangely enough, maybe it might have been first or second grade, was Al Green.
Oh.
Wow.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
My parents used to play a lot of Al Green. So those moments.
Yeah,
Anyway,
I think it's, I often think it's a really an important thing that I've been trying to do. I haven't been doing so well at, was to try to write about when you hear these things, to even just remind your mind about when you heard something for the first time. Of course, like mine was the big trigger or the big shift in me was hearing Thelonious Monk play Around Midnight for the first time. And it was just, and I thought, okay, the piano can do that, because I had been looking at it and the piano wasn't doing that when I was doing it. I kind of want to do that. And I think that when as a listener, right, as a listener or as a reader or as you go to a museum or when you sit down to observe something, when something unexpectedly interrupts your life but gives you like the seed for the rest of your life, those are like great debts are given in that moment. So in the book, the man who is never named who the subject of this book is, except I or you, he ends up really wanting to become a ragtime piano player, and he becomes one, and he becomes a very well-respected piano player, often hired to play private functions and play in the same club where he met this pianist. So then he kind of goes on through his life. But I wanted to pick out that ragtime moment because I thought he captures the excitement of what it must have felt like to hear those new rhythms coming out of this instrument, one, and to hear them continue to change, and what syncopation means. Syncopation is a thing that when I started to really think about this time in the work I was doing on James Reese Europe, the Big Bang of Jazz, when I was thinking about syncopation is Black folks saying the downbeat is taking too long. We got to get to it now. Right? And it's got to happen over and over. You know what I mean? Like, so syncopation is that. It just is. It's just like, wait a minute. It can't always be on the beat. No, it can't work that way. And sometimes figuring out this code of what syncopation really means and thinking about that era, he captures it when he talks about this guy playing in this club, and it made me really want to go. We don't have lots of recordings of that era, but we do have the texts. So now it's the time for me to go back and really dive into that stuff.
Can I just? It's something that you said that I thought was so profound. I just wanted to go back to really quickly, which is about. There's a whole thing about inheritance there, right? Because his father gives him the piano and little else, and then he goes to this club, and that's another kind of part of his inheritance, right? Like, I mean, there's these
Yes.
multiple inheritances that are happening, things that are being given to him that he's reworking, which I think is also just an extraordinary part of what makes a tradition, right? You have you inherit something, and that and the European and the African is those inheritances are part of how we have come to be, right? Even in the moments of duress. So yeah,
that's great. Yeah, you know, Imani, maybe that's a great segue into your passages.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll say, okay, I'm just gonna read this one passage. I'll just also say, you know, the thing that's so interesting to me about this book is how much, and I don't know if you all experience this, but how much there are moments that remind me of my own life, which are just sort of extraordinary, right? And some of it is the language, but one is like I kept thinking about my grandfather's piano, which he passed in 1970. It still sits in the house, right? Like waiting for someone to play. And there's there's other string players in the family. There's other musicians, but there's no pianist, but it's like, it's sitting there for us. Right. And I similarly, this passage about his encounter, the ex-colored man's encounter in a Black church, which I find fascinating for how it echoes the Johnson brothers themselves. So I'm going to read it and then just say a little bit. John Brown was a jet black man of medium size with a strikingly intelligent head and face and a voice like an organ peal. He preached each night after several lesser lights successively held the pulpit during an hour or so. As far as subject matter is concerned, all of the sermons were alike. Each began with the fall of man, ran through various trials and tribulations of the Hebrew children, onto the redemption by Christ, and ended with a fervid picture of the judgment day and the fate of the damned. But John Brown possessed magnetism and an imagination so free and daring that he was able to carry through what the other preachers would not attempt. He knew all the arts and tricks of oratory, the modulation of the voice to almost a whisper, the pause for effect, the rise through light rapid-fire sentences to the terrific thundering outbursts of an electrifying climax. In addition, he had the intuition of a born theatrical manager. Night after night, this man held me fascinated. He convinced me that, after all, eloquence consists more in the manner of saying than in what is said. It is largely a matter of tone pictures. And, right? Like, so the sound and the art in the sermonic tradition is just such a critical part, right? Of it. It captures the emotion and the intellect. So I love, and he goes on to talk about the journey that the pastor takes him on. And I also love it too, because, at least James was not a religious man. He was an atheist, he was not, but he was fascinated by the spiritual dimensions and the oratorical tradition in the church. And so I just love he captured those details despite that.
Yeah, it's, well, also, I mean, one thing that I guess we probably all experience, but on Sundays are the best productions in the world.
Yes, indeed.
We can really think we're doing something at the Kennedy Center, but I got to say, the way how a service unfolds,
yes,
week after week, midweek, the rehearsals for it, all the music, man, I love that him saying, all the previous preachers, they would all do the same thing, right? But he knew, like, that's like, I think for musicians, it's like a soloist, totally. Oh, God, okay, you're gonna play every cliche? Oh, go ahead, let me show you something, right? And then, there was also a part of that is about an improvising tradition, about how to maneuver the moment, and how do you pull an audience, how do you pull them into the whisper so that they don't get bored and say, yo, why don't you get to the point? But that they'll wait for the salvation of the word, Mark, I'm sorry.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's interesting. There's also, I think, is it that preacher or there's another one, right? Where, oh no, it wasn't a preacher, but it was,
Brother Johnson.
Yeah, but there's a preacher, but there's also the organ player, and he talks about the organ of the art of doing that and about how he directs the sermon.
Yes.
and how he sometimes
Yes.
completes it for the preacher if the preacher is maybe kind of not doing as well as he could be.
Right.
If the preacher is doing, really well, then he kind of knows when to play and when not to, and how to, basically bring the performance to its greatest height, right?
Yeah.
Remember that section where they talk about that, and then they talk about the whole vocabulary of songs that he knows,
Yes.
right, and how to use them. And they're also improvisers, and explains
Right.
what way they're improvisers.
It,
I
you
thought
know,
that was very interesting.
Yeah, it unlocks a lot,
Yeah.
and I would say that, I mean, when we work with, as a pianist, right, like the
Mhm.
big part is that you're an accompanist most of the time. So
Right.
a lot
Yeah.
of students really want to work on taking the great solo. I'm like, yo, you better
Yeah.
learn to accompany somebody. 'Cause
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
what you're
that's
doing
it.
most of the time.
Yeah.
You're not going to be soloing. You're going to be comping, what we
Yeah.
call comping. But, and I think one thing that the Kennedy Center has continued to help me realize is the way, you can comp out of your tradition, so, okay, so you comp for a saxophonist like Mark. Okay, great. That's one thing. Okay, so, but how do you comp for a dialogue? How do you comp for a
Yeah.
poet? How do you comp for a
Mm.
skateboarder?
Yeah.
How do you comp for a
Yeah.
historian?
Yeah.
And so that the comping
Yeah.
then has to have these modes that it can and work. And so him talking about that organist, I remember that feeling like, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, exactly. It is so. It's interesting.
Yeah.
I was really
Yeah.
struck by that moment.
Yeah. It's but I also really, one thing that, comes up in the book, and maybe it's because of I think of it as, obviously as his relationship kind of as a songwriter, like he and his brother, John Rosamond Johnson, they both are also writing songs,
Yes.
That's right.
just songs. And
Mhm.
they were
Yeah.
their own crew before the Gershwin brothers,
That's right.
Right.
So they were writing these songs, but he's also, one thing that I love that he does before he talks about that ragtime moment is he talks about what it feels like to walk into a club, the club of that
Yes.
time. So
Yeah.
he there's no photograph of these spaces, right? Not the interior. Might see the exterior of these places before Prohibition, right? And what they look like. We don't see the interior. And he's like, nah, you went down here and then you went upstairs and it was a different crew. Then you went
Yeah.
back there and then they were playing craps, right?
Right.
You
Yeah.
went upstairs and that's where the piano player was. And I love he says this
Right.
thing like, and when you were drinking, you'd leave all the empty bottles on the table so that everybody knew what you were drinking. Kind of like,
Yeah, right.
Uh-huh.
so real New York club stuff.
Yeah.
Still to this day, leave the empty bottles to show everybody how much I'm drinking tonight. But that he puts the language on the places where these kind of revelations happen.
Right.
Mhm.
And so it's not simply with which I think maybe this is what we value writers for. It's not simply what the music is, it's just where the space is, who the people are in the room that also have a lot of impact on what the sound of the music is. How does ragtime sound when you're drunk?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and in many ways, like this is why it's published in 1912, but it's before the Harlem Renaissance began. But why this is understood as the novel that is like where he's like the father figure to the Renaissance, because he's able to paint this picture that then becomes like the center of Black literary culture. Nearly a decade afterwards, and also to talk about how music makes you feel, to try to put words to it. I mean, he sets the stage for so many writers doing that afterwards. So he paints the picture, but he also like ushers in a tradition.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And a few years ago, actually when Mark and I were talking, and he was talking about writing some music for James Weldon Johnson, and it was at a time right at the same moment that I was working on James Reese Europe. So there was these 2 weeks at the Village Vanguard where Mark was playing his James Weldon Johnson music, and the next week I was playing my James Reese Europe music. And I thought, look at us. But fortunately, Mark, maybe you can talk about, I know you've also he's going to premiere a clip of this gig, and that we'll all be hearing because most of us weren't there for the first time. But maybe you can set us up for this clip.
Yeah. So I wrote this suite, maybe, I don't know, 4 years ago, and performed it at Village Vanguard. And part of the reason why I there are many reasons why I read the book. But I read the book long ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago. I was looking for a way to compose. So I think there are 11 chapters, if I remember, if you want to call them chapters. And so there are 11 pieces of music. They're not exactly coinciding with every chapter, but it's just a way to organize it. And, you know, during that, I read some selections from the book as well. So kind of in between. So anyway, part of the reason I got into it, I have some pictures of my family. Part of the reason I got into it because it was about passing and about that. And there's some of that in my own family, starting with my mother. So I'm going to show this picture of my mother when she was young and sexy. So this is my mother here, right there.
Beautiful.
And so she used to tell stories of, you know, she used to tell stories about what the white people were saying and all kinds of stuff when I was a kid. And actually, when she was a kid, she was in a kind of sort of mixed neighborhood. She lived on the campus in a HBCU called, well, before it's now it's called Central State, with my grandparents. But anyway, the white kids, when they didn't know she was white, but then when they found out, they called her a white nigger. That was the word. It was common then, actually. So I'll keep going. So let's go back in time a little bit. These are my grandparents in the middle and my great-grandparents on the sides.
Wow.
So now I'll explain a little bit. I'll come back to that picture. So these are my great aunts and uncles. So this is in the 19th century. So there's the two, it's a little, there it goes, a little bit better there. Yeah. The two, this is the oldest one. This is my mother's great grandfather. But the two in the middle, the aunts, they married white men, white guys, and they moved to Michigan. And of course, that's the last we saw of them. But they used to, this guy, the older brother here on this side, and his son used to go visit them, but his wife, my great grandmother, couldn't go because she was a little too dark. But they could pass, and they went. And so sometimes my grandmother would go too. She could go. So that's kind of, I just found that all that intriguing, and then so that there's this book that kind of goes into all the details and all, you know, obviously much more, but has a lot to do with that. And the, you know, protagonist eventually makes the decision that my great aunts made, right? So I found that interesting. So I was really intrigued by the book because it had something to do with my own life, my own family. So, okay, so let's hear the clip. That's
great.
From the, Right. So that's it.
Oh,
Yeah.
gorgeous.
That was amazing. That is beautiful.
Gorgeous.
You're too kind.
Yeah, no, that was really that. So who's in the band? Just so we acknowledge who is playing.
Well, part of it's your band. Now she's playing drums.
Sheet Waits, yeah.
Yeah, Jason Palmer is playing trumpet. And W.B. Reyes is playing piano. And Matt Brewer is playing bass.
Beautiful.
So that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know what chapter that is? That would number that?
Yeah, that's the second one. So it's if it's a chapter, it's kind of the second chapter. So it's kind of he's young. You know, it's kind of between the school age chapter and when he starts to go to college. He's a young man about to experience the world. Then he gets robbed, and it's kind of that.
It's I mean this ascension, right? Like thinking about in Lift Every Voice and Sing, like how the rising sun, like these phrases that you have that keep ascending and then they come out and they kind of try to come up again, just really, so all that to say, Mark, I really hope that you do finish. I'm sorry, you are finished. Sorry.
Yes, I'm finished.
How beautiful that project is, but also that hopefully you record that and that people can hear that because it sounds necessary. Let me say that. It sounds necessary to the trajectory of who we are, to hear this suite of music. So thanks also for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you.
That brings up a thing about like this book also is it also has a playlist in it. So he talks about Beethoven, Pathetique, he talks about other music, and then he talks about near the end of the book, he talks about Chopin, the 13th Nocturne. And I wondered if you all kind of like, do you like Imani, like when you're writing, like do you also think of playlists, like
all
that
the time.
Mm-hmm.
Always. Right. There's always, I mean, I can't write while I listen to music because I can't pay attention to the music. I mean, to pay attention to the writing if I'm listening to music, but absolutely. And that choice, a piece, both the complexity and the is so emotional and is right before, it is the revelation of his blackness. It's after he's encountered Shiny, his black friend, and he has to tell the woman he loves, I'm a black man. And there's something about that encounter that's like, she has to know me. Yeah. And that becoming the vehicle for it, it's just. Yeah,
that, just to set that up for a second was, so he's in New York and he's started dating this white woman and they're on the street and then Shiny, his homeboy from school, is standing there next to him. And he's like, at that moment, like, do I
Right.
Did I say something to him?
Yeah,
Or
exactly.
do you
Yeah.
do the New York thing? Like I see him, I'll say something to him later.
Right.
And
But
then-
he was like, "Nah, I'm gonna talk to my man," and he
Yes.
does, and which I wasn't sure what he was gonna do, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
But that he comes home, and I'll read this section because now he's made me rethink Chopin and how it should be used. Right, all the times I've practiced Chopin in private, right, for myself, and listening to other pianists play it, I never thought it as like the admission of blackness song.
Right.
But it's soulful.
It's soulful. It is soulful. So he says, you know, so he's talking about the 13th Nocturne. And he says, and when I began, she drew a chair near to my right and sat leaning with her elbow on the end of the piano, her chin resting on her hand and her eyes reflecting the emotions which the music awoke in her. An impulse which I could not control rushed over me, a wave of exultation. The music under my fingers sank almost to a whisper, like this preacher, and calling her for the first time by her Christian name. But without daring to look at her, I said, I love you, I love you, I love you. My fingers are trembling so that I ceased playing. I felt her hand creep to mine, and when I looked at her, her eyes were glistening with tears. I understood and could scarcely resist the longing to take her in my arms, but I remembered that which has been the sacrificial altar of so much happiness, duty. And bending over her hand in mine, I said, yes, I love you, but there is something more too that I must tell you. Then I told her in what words I do not know, which is deep, which words I do not know, the truth. I felt her hand grow cold. And when I looked up, she was gazing at me with a wild, fixed stare, as though I was some object she had never seen. Under the strange light in her eyes, I felt that I was growing black and thick-featured and crimp-haired. She appeared not to have comprehended what I said. Her lips trembled, and she attempted to say something to me, but the words stuck in her throat. She dropped her head on the piano. She began to weep, the great sobs that shook her frail body. I tried to console her and blurted out incoherent words of love. But this seemed only to increase her distress. And when I left her, she was still weeping. You know, so he's playing this song as the ultimate intro, I think, you know, like, it's like this, it's a gorgeous, but it's a heartbreaking song, you know, that once I finished the book, I said, let me go check out this 13th Nocturne. And when I played it, Alicia walked out of the bedroom and she said, what is that sad song you're playing? You know, because it is wrenching. So I asked, you know, for everyone out there who has read the book to now go listen to the 13th Nocturne. And I think about that, you know, maybe dubbing, you know, the 13th Nocturne needs to be retitled, you know, Black Admission, something insane like that. But you know, but that songs that unlock the next possibility for your life, and that in their love affair, then it reveals a new truth for him. So maybe talk about just this last moment in the book.
You go ahead, Mark.
Okay, I'll go ahead. The one thing that's interesting for me is that you know, eventually she accepts him, and they marry and they have children, and he, you know, eventually actually there's a part of the end where I read that in the suite, but you know, he kind of laments or regrets his decision. It's kind of a bittersweet moment, because on the other hand, he doesn't regret it, because he had children, he had a family with the love of his life.
Right.
You know, it's kind of it's sort of a devil's bargain or something like that, you know.
Yeah.
And then he, you know, at the very end, it's just kind of interesting how he it's almost like that's what he has to do, you know, somehow. He almost has no choice. So.
I mean, it's a heartbreaking ending. I think it's
definitely
not a happy ending, and it's and it has there's a melancholy to it about what he lost, also in terms of the opportunities of what he could give his people. Right? There's a reference to Booker T. Washington. He hears Booker T. Washington. He's like, "Oh, have I given up
Right.
Yeah.
what I'm supposed to give my people. But I also, it's, it strikes me because there's a lynching scene, which I think for folk that is part of the decision, right? He witnesses a lynching and but he actually goes through a death, right? The end, he describes it almost as a death, the departure from blackness, right? Into a new life as a white man. And so that's also, I think, a really interesting, like almost literary device, what does it mean to crossing over? Because all the loss, which people who passed experienced so much loss,
Yeah.
family, loved one.
And now he's devoted to his children, right? The real fruit, and the last sentence of the book, which is, it's a long sentence, which, in my terrible Texas taught English class, they'd say never to write a sentence that long.
Yeah, but it works though, isn't it?
You know what I mean?
That's
but
right, it works.
It does.
So the last phrase, it's like that, epic train line, like it just doesn't stop. It just keeps
Exactly.
going. But the last few words is, I have sold any, that I have sold any, or after all, I have chosen the lesser part, that I have sold my birthright for a mess of pottage. And then he leaves you. He leaves you, So he's talking about all this resolution that happens in ragtime, all these kind of moments in his life where he's the song has been altered, and he has to, okay, well, let me deal with that change. And he's now at that point where he's now got to plant his foot again. We don't know what happens for the rest of his life, but we do see that he continues to make this decision that he will probably in another 3 years regret again. And there's something, but that I think, I don't know, what James Weldon Johnson's birthday is, but I think that there's something about the feeling of not like tying everything up, right? That and that the end of the book kind of falls to this space that leaves you very murky when you emerge from it. When I stood up from reading it, I was not ready to talk to anybody about it. So that's why I took the piece of music out and started playing through it, because I thought, well, let me hear with the song that clouds this last space. How do you play the song that sends everybody out, right? So now we're near the end of our discussion, where just like the book, we've brought you down through many territories and what James Weldon Johnson has revealed in the book about the history in the book, but more that it doesn't ever really quite turn out how we might expect, and that listening to music also doesn't also have to do that either. And so that was something that also I felt like, oh, thank you for making an ending that kind of left me bleeding. And the need for that, the need to feel that, because I also feel like the books right now, I'm not sure of what you all have been reading during this time, and Imani will, but I know that books right now have been the source for me about how to move through a time when it seems so murky. They have kind of validated the feeling that I have, and maybe and so I thank you both for kind of having this discussion with me in our second Kennedy Center Book Club. So thank you, Dr. Imani Perry, and thank you, Mark Turner, for playing music, for helping us understand the dimensions of James Weldon Johnson's masterpiece of a short 100-page novel. And Dr. Perry, you also said that you're not only on sabbatical, but you are also at the cusp of presenting a new book. And so maybe you'll just kind of tell us
really quick. So January 2022, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon Line to Understand the Soul of a Nation. So
new book, right? So that I look forward to that. We all look forward to it. And and Mark, thank you really for sharing that music too, because that is the part that I think is also the center of our conversation, is how do we kind of talk about the language around the music, what it feels like to make it, and then listen to something. So Dianne Reeves, in the first discussion, she played a beautiful composition. Then she read a portion of jazz on top of her composition.
Oh, nice.
Here, your piece also kind of continues this thread. So thank you for sharing it. And thank you all for joining us on August. The Kennedy Center thanks you. Our jazz season is up. This is a version of a jazz season. Please go online and continue to support the arts, continue to support the music. Please stay safe and please keep reading. All right. Thank you all. Have a good night.
Good night. See you all.